another occasion, said he, on which accident was taken for principle. I failed in my expedition against the Russians, and they therefore consider themselves invincible. But can anything be more erroneous? Ask men of sense and reflection among them. Ask Alexander himself, and let him recollect the opinions he entertained at the time. Was I defeated by the efforts of the Russians? No! My failure must be attributed to pure accident, to absolute fatality. First, the capital was burnt to the ground by foreign intriguers and in defiance of its inhabitants. Second, the frost set in with such unusual suddenness and severity that it was regarded as a kind of phenomenon. To these disasters must be added a mass of false reports, silly intrigues, treachery, stupidity, and in short, many things that will perhaps one day come to light, and which will excuse or justify the two great errors I committed in diplomacy and war, namely, to have undertaken such an enterprise, leaving on my flanks, which soon became my rear, 2 cabinets of which I was not master, and 2 allied armies who, on the least check, would become my enemies. But to come to a conclusion, and to annul with a word every charge that can be brought against me, I may say that this famous war, this bold enterprise, were perfectly involuntary on my part. I did not wish to give battle, neither did Alexander. But being once in presence, circumstances urged us on, and fate accomplished the rest. After a few moments' silence, as if waking from a reverie, the emperor added, "A Frenchman had in his hands the fate of the world. If he had possessed judgment and spirit equal to the exalted situation in which he was placed, if he had been a good Swede, as he pretended he was, he might have restored the glory and power of his adopted country, have retaken Finland, and arrived at St. Petersburg before I reached Moscow. But he was swayed by personal considerations, silly vanity, and all sorts of mean passions. His head was turned when he saw that he, an old Jacobin, was courted and flattered by legitimates, when he found himself face to face holding political and friendly conferences with an emperor of all the Russias, who took great pains to cajole him. It is affirmed that hints were even thrown out to him of the possibility of his obtaining the hand of one of the sisters of the Russian emperor by divorcing his wife, and in a letter addressed to him by a French prince, the writer remarked with complacency that Bern was the cradle of both their houses, the houses of B. Forsooth, dazzled by his rise of fortune, he sacrificed both his adopted and his mother country, his own glory, his true power, the cause of the people, and the welfare of Europe. For this he will pay dearly. No sooner had he accomplished all that was expected of him than he began to feel what awaited him. It is said that he has repented of his conduct, but he has not yet expiated it. He is now the only upstart sovereign in Europe. The scandal cannot remain unpunished. It would be too dangerous an example. The 12th, the emperor, adverting to his return from the island of Elba and his second fall at Waterloo, made some remarkable observations on both these subjects. It is very certain, said he, that during the events of 1815 I relinquished the anticipation of ultimate success. I lost my first confidence. Perhaps I found that I was wearing beyond the time of life at which fortune usually proves favorable, or perhaps, in my own eyes, in my own imagination, the spell that had hung over my miraculous career was broken. But at all events, I felt that something was wanting. Kind fortune no longer followed my footsteps and took pleasure in lavishing her smiles upon me. She was now succeeded by rigid fate, who took ample revenge for the few favors which I obtained, as it were by force. It is a remarkable fact that every advantage I obtained at this period was immediately succeeded by a reverse. I marched through France and arrived in the capital amidst the enthusiasm and universal acclamations of the people. But no sooner had I reached Paris than by a sort of magic, and without any adequate motive, all around me retracted and grew cold. I had adduced plausible reasons for obtaining a sincere reconciliation with Austria, whither I had dispatched agents more or less acknowledged. But Murat was there with his fatal enterprise. It was concluded at Vienna that he was acting under my orders and measuring me by their own scale. They regarded my whole conduct as a complication of artifice and determined to overreach me by counter-intrigue. The opening of my campaign was well managed and proved most successful. I should have surprised the enemy in detail, but that a deserter from among our generals gave him timely notice of my plans. I gained the brilliant victory of Ligny, but my lieutenant robbed me of its fruits. Finally, I triumphed, even at Waterloo, and was immediately hurled into the abyss. Yet I must confess that all these strokes of fate distressed me more than they surprised me. I felt the presentiment of an unfortunate result. Not that this in any way influenced my determinations and measures, but the foreboding certainly haunted my mind. That such was really Napoleon's state of feeling at the period here alluded to is evident from the following anecdote, which is so very remarkable that I cannot forbear presenting it to the reader. When on the banks of the Sambre, the emperor early one morning approached a bivouac fire, accompanied only by his aide-de-camp on duty, General C. Some potatoes were boiling on the fire, and the emperor asked for one and began to eat it. Then, with meditative and somewhat melancholy expression, he uttered the following broken sentences. After all, it is endurable. Man may live in any place and in any way. The moment perhaps is not far remote. Themistocles, the aide-de-camp above mentioned, who himself related this circumstance to me since my return to Europe, observed that the emperor had been successful. These words would have passed away without leaving any impression on him, but not after the catastrophe, and particularly after reading the celebrated letter to the Prince Regent. He had been struck with the recollection of the bivouac of the Sambre, and Napoleon's manner, tone, and expression had since so haunted his mind that he could never banish the circumstance from his memory. It is a mistake to suppose that Napoleon was on all occasions inspired by that internal confidence which his acts and decisions seemed to denote when he quitted the Tuileries in January 1814 to enter upon his immortal but unfortunate campaign in the environs of Paris. His mind was depressed by gloomy apprehensions, and a circumstance that bears evidence of his penetrating foresight is that at the period in question he felt convinced of what the majority of the individuals about him were far from suspecting, namely that if he fell, it would be by the Bourbons. This idea he communicated to a few of his particular friends who vainly endeavored to rouse his confidence by vainly representing that the Bourbons were forgotten, that they were wholly unknown to the present generation. There is the real danger, was his invariable reply. Thus, immediately after his eloquent and impressive harangue to the officers of the National Guard, in which, among other things, he said, "You elected me, I am your work, it is for you to defend me," and which he concluded by presenting to them the Empress and the King of Rome, saying, "I go to oppose the enemy, and I consign to your care all that I hold most dear." Immediately after delivering this address, which, on the point of quitting the Tuileries, he foresaw at that decisive moment the treachery and perfidy that awaited him, he resolved to secure the person of him who proved to be the mainspring of the plot by which his overthrow was effected. He was prevented from executing his intention only by representations, and it may even be said offers a personal responsibility on the part of some of his ministers, who assured him that the individual suspected had more reason than anyone else to dread the return of the Bourbons. Napoleon yielded, at the same time emphatically expressing fears that he might have cause to regret his forbearance. The following circumstance, which is but little known, is important, since it proves how much, in the height of the crisis, Napoleon's thoughts were directed towards the Bourbons. After the check sustained at Brienne, the evacuation of Detroit, the forced retreat on the Seine, and the degrading conditions which were transmitted from Châtillon, but which were so generously rejected, the emperor was closeted with one of his friends, overpowered at the sight of the miseries that were impending on France, suddenly rose from his chair, exclaiming with warmth, "Perhaps I still possess the means of saving France. What if I were myself to recall the Bourbons? The Allies would then be compelled to arrest their course under pain of being overwhelmed with disgrace and detected in their duplicity under pain of being forced to acknowledge that their designs are directed against our territory rather than against my person. I should sacrifice all to the country. I should become the mediator between the French people and the Bourbons. I should oblige the latter to accede to the national laws and to swear fidelity to the existing compact. My glory and name would be a guarantee to the French people. As to me, I have reigned long enough. My career is filled with acts of glory, and this last will not be esteemed the least. I shall rise the higher by descending thus far. Then, after a pause of some moments, he added, but can a repulsed dynasty ever forgive? Can it ever forget? Can the Bourbons be trusted? May not Fox be right in his famous maxim respecting restorations? Overcome by grief and anxiety, he threw himself on his couch and was shortly after roused to be made acquainted with the march of the flank of Blucher's corps, on which he had for some time been secretly keeping watch. He rose to put into action that new spring of resources, energy, and glory which will forever consecrate the names of Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, Vauchamp, Nangy, Montereau, Crayon, etc. These marvelous successes dismayed Alexander and the English and suggested to them the expediency of treating. They might indeed have entirely changed the face of affairs had not Napoleon's designs been thwarted by accidents beyond the reach of human calculation. For example, the important orders that were not communicated to the viceroy, the defection of Murat, the indolence and negligence of certain chiefs, and finally even the successful movements of the French, which by separating the Emperor of Austria from the other allied sovereigns left the latter entirely free to plan the abdication of Fontainebleau, an event which will ever be celebrated in the history of our destiny and our moral character. Philosophic thinkers, painters of the human heart, turn your eyes to Fontainebleau and contemplate the fall of the greatest of monarchs. Observe how the retinue by which the unfortunate hero was surrounded, those whom he had loaded with favors, honors, and riches, after the first frown of fortune, forsook, betrayed, and even sought to insult him. Mark how the first among them in rank, favor, and confidence, he whom the great prince had vainly sought to inspire with exalted sentiment by treating him as his companion and his friend. Mark how this man degraded himself to the level of the Mameluke, whose native manners rendered him perhaps more excusable, and who thought it perfectly natural to forsake his fallen master. At Fontainebleau, the crisis being fulfilled, and while Napoleon was earnestly engaged, his favorite companion presented himself before him to solicit permission to proceed to Paris, only, as he said, for a short time and for the purpose of settling some business, after which he declared his intention of returning to the Emperor, never again to leave him. But Napoleon could read the secret to the human mind, and the individual here alluded to had no sooner withdrawn than the Emperor, breaking from the subject on which he was engaged, said to the person with whom he had been conversing, "There he goes to seal his own degradation, and in spite of all his protestations, he will never come back again." He spoke truly. The deserter hastened to greet the first rays of the rising sun, and no sooner had it shone upon him than he renounced his benefactor, his friend, and his master. In speaking of the Emperor, he was even known to use the expressions, "that man," and yet Napoleon so readily forgave human weakness, and was so superior to every feeling of rancor and resentment, that on his return from Elba he expressed regret at not seeing the individual who had acted so treacherous a part, adding with a smile, "The rogue is afraid of me, I suppose. But he has no reason to be. The only punishment I should have inflicted on him would have been to require him to appear before me in his new costume. They tell me he looks even uglier than usual." And how many instances of private turpitude might not be mentioned? I myself can attest that an individual who had been most remarkable for his base conduct on returning from Fontainebleau appeared one of the most forward at the Tuileries on the 20th of March. He appeared very much disconcerted at the accidental or intended solitude in which he was left by all the rest, a witness of his late misconduct, burying the recollection of past troubles in the present joy, hastened to him and relieved him from his embarrassment. Such generosity cost little at that moment. Au cœur heureux, les vertus sont faciles. To happy hearts, virtue is easy. I refer to the manuscript of 1814 for a picture of these mortifying events. The reader may there learn. But no, he will learn nothing new. In all circumstances, at all times, in all countries, men, and particularly courtiers, are ever the same. And it must be recollected that by this time Napoleon's camp had become a court. Let not these men say that their conduct was dictated by a regard for the welfare and interest of their country. The thought of securing the undisturbed enjoyment of the wealth and honors they had acquired in their minds superseded every patriotic consideration. But history will be just. I say history, for the bulk of the present generation cannot even claim this sad honor. Where was our indignation? Where was our reprobation authentically and solemnly pronounced? And let it be understood that this is a point wholly unconnected with political considerations. The question is not what cause these men supported, but merely what moral principle they profess. But it must not be supposed that discontented misanthropy would lead me to draw a picture discouraging all hearts and to conclude by the prescription of all mankind. By no means. I am well aware that the moment of great trials is that of great extremities, and that amidst the basest passions the most brilliant heroism and noble virtue shine conspicuous. Therefore, honor be those veteran bands whose bitter tears attested their sincere sorrow. Honored be those innumerable subaltern officers to whom a word would have been the signal for shedding every drop of their blood. Honored be the generous peasantry who presented to our troops their last morsel of bread, and disregarding their own privations parted with all to aid the brave defenders of their country. Honored be those generous sentiments that were expressed by the citizens of every class, sex, and age. If, on the one side, the heart is roused to indignation, it finds a delicious source of gratification on the other. As St. Helena the Emperor dictated an account of the events of Fontainebleau and his removal to the island of Elba, but my memory does not enable me to quote any of the facts thus detailed. I took no notes of them because, with the view of abridging my own labor, I laid down the rule of passing over those subjects that were dictated to others, being assured that they would be faithfully recorded. Besides, the narrative to which I have just alluded is destined for publication. I shall therefore merely subjoin a few particulars which I presume are not included in it and which are collected from Napoleon's conversation or other authentic sources. When the disasters of 1814 were apparent, when the danger was imminent, particularly after the entrance of the Allies into Paris, many of the French generals began to waver. Those in whom selfishness prevailed over patriotism, those who preferred to retire from the fatigues of war rather than to obey the dictates of duty, honor, and glory, urged on the catastrophe instead of seeking to avert it. The most distinguished chiefs ventured to advise the abdication and declared it to be indispensable. Some even went so far as to hint to the emperor that they could not answer for the consequences of the dissatisfaction and indignation which the soldiers manifested towards him, while, on the contrary, as Napoleon himself said, such was the attachment of the troops and the devotedness of the officers that if I had made known the machinations that were plotting, I certainly should have endangered those who were guilty of such misrepresentation. A single word from me would have sacrificed them. Napoleon reviewed the troops. Their acclamations were enthusiastic in general. It appeared as though adversity served only to render the emperor the more dear to them, for their attachment was never so decidedly expressed. It was impossible, could be otherwise, said Napoleon. Such was the identity of these brave men with me, and such our mutual sympathy. I never entertained a doubt of their attachment. In this extremity, Napoleon profoundly reflected on what course it was advisable for him to pursue. He yet possessed 40 or 50,000 troops, the best and most devoted in the world. He might, without risk, have overawed or dismissed the faithless generals. In his state of things, 3 different measures by turns presenting themselves to his mind. The first was to return upon Paris, for he imagined that no general on earth would be bold enough to give him battle with that immense capital in his rear. At my command, said the emperor, the whole population would have risen. I should suddenly have found my forces recruited by the addition of 100,000 or 200,000 men, but the Allies, on retiring, might have burnt the capital, and this disaster would have been accounted my work. It is true the burning of Paris might have proved in reality the salvation of France, as the burning of Moscow was the salvation of Russia, but such sacrifices can only be made by the parties interested. The second idea which suggested itself to the emperor's mind was to proceed to Italy to form a junction with the viceroy, but this, said Napoleon, would have been a desperate course without the chance of obtaining an adequate result. It would have removed the theater of conflict to too remote a point. Public enthusiasm would have had time to subside, and we should no longer have been fighting in France, on whose sacred soil alone we could hope to work the prodigies that had become indispensable. Neither of these two measures would have been practicable. Only the third course therefore remained, and this was to continue on the defensive, to dispute every foot of ground, and to maintain the war until new chances should arise. The stupor which the presence of the invaders had produced would soon be dispelled. The miseries they created would soon render them the objects of execration. The national enthusiasm would revive, and the Allies would find their graves in the land which they had presumed to violate. But this must necessarily have been the work of time. In a word, success was doubtful, or at least remote, while the sufferings of the people were certain, immediate, and incalculable. The noble mind of Napoleon was moved, and he resolved to abdicate. Meanwhile, he dispatched to the Emperor Alexander a deputation of marshals, among whom was the Duke of Ragusa, one of those to whom he was most fondly attached. The deputation was instructed to propose the abdication of Napoleon in favor of his son. The emperor thus hoped to save France, to secure her independence and the duration of her existing institutions. The Emperor Alexander, who had several days before publicly declared that he would not treat either with Napoleon or any of the members of his family, nevertheless discussed the subject contradictorily with that party of the Senate who proposed the abdication. The marshal spoke vehemently, and in the name of the whole army. Alexander's determination was shaken, and the party favorable to the regency seemed likely to prevail, when intelligence arrived of the defection of the Duke of Ragusa, and this circumstance confirmed Alexander in his private previous resolution. The event came upon him like a ray of light. The army then is not unanimous, thought he. From that moment, setting aside all reserve, he declared himself to be inflexible. In this state of things, Napoleon was surrounded, urged, and harassed to sign his positive and unconditional abdication. He yielded after a great internal struggle, and dictated the act of abdication in the following terms. The Allied powers, having proclaimed that the Emperor Napoleon is the only obstacle to the reestablishment of the peace of Europe, the Emperor, faithful to his oath, renounces for himself and his heirs the thrones of France and Italy, and declares that there is no sacrifice, even that of life, which he is not ready to make for the interests of France. This declaration, which the Allies were far from expecting in so absolute a form, smoothed away every difficulty, and the marshals returned with what is called the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which I shall presently insert. I find in Baron Fane's manuscript of 1814 a complete explanation of certain remarks made by the emperor, which I noted down at the time without exactly comprehending their meaning. In the fifth part of this journal, the emperor, alluding to the Treaty of Fontainebleau, says, "I will have nothing to do with that treaty. I disclaim it. Far from being proud of it, I blush for it. It was discussed for me and against my will." And on another occasion, he says, when the history of the events of Fontainebleau comes to be known, it will afford ample room for surprise. The manuscript of 1814 proves that Napoleon had indeed nothing to do with the Treaty of Fontainebleau. The utmost exertions were employed to prevail on him to sign the treaty, and he was at length only influenced by the public considerations that were adduced in support of it. He thought it both degrading and useless to sign the treaty. Having survived his greatness, he wished henceforth to live as a private individual, and he was mortified to reflect that the vast sacrifice that had been made for the peace of the world should be mingled with pecuniary arrangements. Of what use is a treaty, said he, since they will not settle the interests of France with me? If only my personal interests are concerned, there's no need of a treaty. I'm conquered. I yield to the fate of arms. All I ask is that I may not be accounted a prisoner of war, and for that a mere cartel is sufficient. Every endeavor to turn his thoughts to his personal situation, his existence, and future wants proved unavailing. To all such suggestions he energetically replied, "What matters it? A horse and a crown a day are all I want." I, for my part, can bear witness that the Emperor infinitely regretted having ratified the Treaty of Fontainebleau, and this was not the only decision of the period which weighed heavily on his mind. He also very much regretted having yielded, when in his possession of Saint Dizier and Dulevant, to the various representations and suggestions by which he was assailed, and which induced him, against his inclination, to make a countermarch upon Paris. "Here I wanted firmness," said he. "I should have followed up my intention of advancing to the Rhine, collecting reinforcements from all the garrisons on my way, and exciting the rise of the peasantry. By this means I should have possessed an immense army. Murat would immediately have rejoined me, and he and the viceroy would have made me master of Vienna, if the allies had presumed to deprive me of Paris. But no, the enemy would have shrugged from the dangers with which he would have been surrounded. The allied sovereigns would have regarded it as a favor to have been permitted to retire. The storm that assailed us would have subsided. Peace would have been concluded and sincerely maintained. For all were exhausted, all had wounds to heal. Abroad, war could no longer have been thought of, and at home such a result must have had the effect of destroying all illusion, frustrating every evil design, and permanently blending the opinions, views, and interests of all parties. I should once more have seated myself triumphantly on the throne, surrounded by my invincible bands. The heroic and faithful portion of the people would have regulated those who had wavered, and the men who had shown themselves so eager for repose might have enjoyed it. A new generation of chiefs would have remolded our character. Every effort would have been directed to the internal welfare of the country, and France would have been happy.